January 1948 proved to be a turning point in the Transatlantic War. The loss of Pumiapes in the far north greatly weakened the forces which called themselves Free Xerotherma, and as a result they lost the Greater South, including the capital islands, to the Bastard Lords, relegated solely to mainland holdings in Peng Bay. Meanwhile, with the islands under his control, Rex Tarkhan Indichides Deostum crowned himself the Praedu-Laucum, and refashioned his portion of Xerotherma into a proper kingdom, handing down laws and establishing officer corps to enforce them. Of course, the Second Xerothermite Civil War wasn't quite over, but for all intents and purposes, half of Xerotherma might as well have been a different country altogether. Now, the Praedu-Laucum set his sights upon a much grander prize, the Panama Canal. If he could take control of that precious point of naval traffic, then he could return it to its proper use as a tool of international commerce, and build for himself a war chest with which to take revenge on his enemy in the Transatlantic War, Avarignia. Notably, as a member of the Greater Indichidi House, Tarkhan removed the prominent K from the flag of Xerotherma, which was a tribute to the hanged man himself, Kairos Caritas, who founded Xerotherma. This flag now differentiated Free Xerotherma in the north with the Kingdom of Xerotherma in the south. All of this infighting worked out in favor of Avarignia at the end of the day, which lazily sent ships across the sea to harass and raid cities on both sides of the conflict, by which they would amass much wealth throughout 1948. Meanwhile, the bulk of their attention had long since been drawn to the West African Wars, which nearly came to an end in February of 1949, with none but Lai Zhou left to resist them. This success was due in large part to Avarignia's swift adaptation to desert terrain, inventing a desert terrain motorcycle called the Tantitsu Mark I. Though, with Lai Zhou's colony in the densely vegetated south, things got more complicated, and the war slowed to a crawl. To the south, Kilwa continued its all-out advance, using its momentum to conquer the Dar el-Kuti, Darfurtit, Azande, Mangbetu, Dinka, Nuer, Toposa, Turkana, Kikuyu, Maasai, Gogo, Nyamwezi, Hehe, Kazembe, Akue, and Bantu Plains tribes. With greater access to the coast, Chief Mapira Malutsi entered into more involved military contracts with the Greek despotates, bringing guns, artillery, and landmines into the continent on a massive scale, forcing conquered peoples from what he considered rival tribes to harvest rubber and mine precious minerals under pain of death. For all intents and purposes, this was slavery, with vast mines dug out by rough-hewn tools and even bare hands, lined for miles out with landmines, patrolled by armed guards day and night. Often, dead or mutilated bodies would be hauled up with the carts of gold, lead, or aluminum, unclear if they were killed by the conditions below, the guards, or even their fellow working miner, with whom they labored shoulder to shoulder for months on end. Chief Malutsi began to have occultists and witch doctors read to him in his free time, which is where he got the idea to consume the bone marrow of albino men for long life and to ward off curses from his many enemies. He even began to hear from the members of a long-dormant cult who taught him of their terrible god, Baal. The kingdoms and tribes which bordered Kilwa began to panic and engaged in alliance building for the first time, forging the Sahel Shield, comprised of Tubu, Darfuria, Ethiopia, and Kanem. Even Lai Zhou was offered entrance, but declined. These states, backwards by the world standard, were some of the only native powers on the continent who could contain Kilwa's bloody advance. Meanwhile, in April of 1950, Mongolistan completely withdrew from international affairs in order to deal with the Great Persian Revolt. It was as though they had entered into a comatose state, completely and utterly without life or action to all who happened upon it. Phrygia, with peace treaty in hand, took this opportunity to conquer the tiny country of Georgia and invade Crete as well, annexing the Sinai Peninsula. It's obvious they were gearing up for another war with those Christians which boxed them in, Sirdia and Mongolistan. In June of that year, Avarignia conducted a surprise lightning invasion of Kanem and took half the country before Crete panicked and launched their own invasion, which ended up splitting its territory between the two powers. Meanwhile, Sahel Shield was essentially powerless to do anything about it, considering Kanem was their main supplier of training, weapons, and gear, and its king was now swinging by a noose in Tripoli. They, too, reached out to the Greek despotates, commonly known by the derogatory demonym Desert Greeks, for weapons of war. This trade in arms and ammunition made the Desert Greeks quite wealthy, and when paired with their vast oil wealth, which fueled their industry as well as being locally traded, they began to bristle against the big players of the region, looking to strike out on their own as major powers instead of regional ones. This led to the Desert Wars, where Alexandropon, Transarabia, and Apatatosa went to war with each other as well as Phrygia and Mongolistan, making rapid gains on all sides in the first months of the war. The Desert War even overlapped with the Great Persian Revolt. Such a conflagration of violence, coupled with the Great Persian Revolt breaching the borders of Mongolistan itself, led to a massive outflow of refugees from the region, 3 million people in the first year alone, flooding into neighboring countries, with destinations like Crete, Rajasthan, and even Sirdia. Now, these arrivals were not received kindly. Crete had armed guards who roamed the desert with the goal of deterring, and if necessary killing, any interlopers, military or not. Crete was a relatively stable empire, and it didn't want to import a problem. Rajasthan took issue with them not being one of the myriad peoples of the subcontinent. Indeed, they were totally alien to them, and as such, the people took up arms to resist their entry instead of the state. Then, Sirdia sank their ships in the Mediterranean, not eager to play host to a mob of heathens and Jews. Phrygia, however, took a different approach, and flung their gates open wide to them. Dr. Avarignia said that the arrival of these desperate destitutes would dissolve any remaining national identity left in Phrygia, and thus solve one of its most dire ills. As such, 2 million Arabs, Persians, Pashtuns, Kurds, Assyrians, and Jews came flooding into the country through 1951. Dr. Avarignia burned what was left of the 3 Ps hoarded and stolen wealth to feed, house, and clothe all of them. To top it all off, he passed what was known as the Resettlement Laws. Under the Resettlement Laws, he forced families to share 4-room apartments with 3 other families. He moved dozens of single men into houses formerly reserved for widows and children. He forced collective farms to triple their output under pain of death. He had family pets seized and slaughtered for food rations, defaming the keeping of cats, dogs, and even hamsters as an irrational and bourgeois practice, and finally he forbade local law enforcement from meting out harsh judgments to his newcomers, lest a chain of systemic inequities begin in the people's power of Phrygia. Avarignia would take at least 4 more women from the refugees into his personal free love harem, and father 11 more children from them. This brought his progeny to a whopping 30 children, whom he anonymously distributed to orphanages across the country in order to avoid participating in the oppressive social construct of fatherhood. For now, the whole system barely limped along, held together by the proverbial carrot of charity and stick of deadly force. Many wondered if it could indeed withstand another wave of refugees, if indeed another one came. To the east, in May of 1952, the Poyang-Namningyan-Borneo War came to an end, with Poyang not only maintaining control of the island, but also annexing the province of Guangdong from Namning. Later that year, the Hayashi shogunate launched an invasion of the Korean peninsula and eastern Siberia, declaring war against the Gaizhou usurper states, beginning the Gaizhou Minimization War. Then, in March of 1953, with Avarignia juggling the Transatlantic War and the Sino-Avarignian West African Colonial War, one of its most dire conflicts yet was heaped upon it: the Containment War. The Pact of Rome, consisting at this point of Italia, Burgundia, Carnia, Phrygia, Germania, Britannia, Samogitia, and most recently Avarignia, brought the entire alliance to bear against Avarignia. Avarignia, realizing the situation it now found itself in, cast about for allies, including Tribalia, that ancient friend of the Avarigines. And yet, they turned their head and gave military access to the Pact of Rome. The Wotansloa, consisting of Iskland, Norland, and Angland, in a surprise move, would join the war on the side of Avarignia as co-belligerents, seeking an opportunity to conquer the Isles once and for all while the Pact of Rome was distracted. Still, even with these surprised allies flocking to their aid, the situation remained bleak. As such, General Vicari Lucchini proffered a dark and foreboding speech on an aircraft carrier off the Balearics. We represent something forgotten. A misty, foreboding thing from man's past, something he thought he could scurry from, hiding amongst technology and social convention, something he thought he would never lay eyes on again. We represent a governing principle of life, and we would argue the governing principle of life. We represent evolution. Something once properly feared. We purify, we kill, we make barren, and we create. Now, in a world of life support and halfway houses, the stinking masses have proliferated by the millions when they should have died betwixt the teeth of some great lion, or found their end as moldering remains at the bottom of a swamp. But worse than them are those that let this happen. Those dreary, weak-willed cousins of ours who have eschewed their holy blood and thus their immortal duty in the name of being nice, in the name of not being a bother, or perhaps in the name of profit. Regardless, the result is the same. Rats are bursting from the walls of the human house, and cockroaches are flooding from the drain pipes. We must hold those accountable who let something like this happen. Beyond our fair-weather friends to the northeast, an entire continent of bankers, aristocrats, and men who have abandoned themselves to comfort and normality lay waiting. They lay waiting with a mercenary army of impossible magnitude ready to make us forgotten again. But we will teach them fear. We will teach them the meaning of it, and we will break their backs upon the wheel of natural law. May we teach their orphans what it means to be great. May we plant orchards among their nameless graves. May we make the vermin fall silent forever, and may we make the men who protect them scream for but a moment. Hail, Avarignia, for you are chosen. Rejoice in the struggle. Blood is your reward. With this, Avarignia made the first move by invading Tribalia, swiftly capturing several major population centers. With this, the Zikne Resnea underwent a major overhaul. Namely, the rank of Elfahus II was reworked entirely. Elfahus II, for those of broadly European descent with one or fewer Avarignian grandparents, now marked them as regular citizens of Avarignia, receiving no special benefits or demerits on the basis of their race. No longer would they have to earn their place to stay, or be marked for deportation. Indeed, the army of Avarignia grew, and it needed soldiers. A man of Elfahus II was able to live a completely normal life, simply not as privileged as the ranks above him, and not marked for death as the one below him. Marriage laws in this respect now allowed for free marriage between Elfahus I and II, though such a marriage between Elfahus II and Resnea was forbidden, only to be approved under special circumstances. This new revision to the Zikne racial licensing program sent shockwaves across Europe at the start of the Containment War, as it turned Nazism and the Avarignian military government from a hostile alien force that wanted to treat the other peoples of Europe poorly to a movement of more general applicability. Now, with the revisions made to Elfahus II, all white men could benefit from Nazism's generous welfare programs, low-crime urban centers, and booming industrial economy. They no longer had much at all to fear if those men in black helmets came marching through their village, town, or city, as Avarignia considered them people, just not privileged people. A situation not so different from the division between themselves and their own aristocracy, save for the fact that Avarignia had done away with the pompous, arbitrary ways of the aristocrats and banking elite. These men, who were the scum of the earth in their aristocratic capitalist systems, would no longer occupy the bottom rung. Indeed, under the Zikne Resnea, there would finally be someone beneath them. People who don't look like them, people they couldn't care less about anyway. All in all, for your average steel mill laborer in Germania, the labor laws and vacation time offered by Avarignia seemed tempting to say the least. And now the last thing that made him scared of their arrival had been done away with. The Pact of Rome realized that they now had to make their own people more afraid of them than tempted by the system of the enemy. They had played their hand, stockpiling weapons and vehicles, food and medicine, all vital tools of conflict and state, and they thought they had picked the perfect time to strike, but alas. The Pozzies had called their bluff and responded in kind, going all in by overhauling their most controversial hallmark and invading a neutral country to put the pact in the defensive to boot. Indeed, for whom was the situation more dire? Avarignia, flanked on all sides by enemies and up to its neck in bloody war? Or the Pact of Rome, which had fumbled its opening and lost face in a way they didn't even think was possible?